Lecture, we're going to talk about two different systems of government. One of which is the unitary, confederal, and federal system of government, which we've talked about quite a bit. And there's another system of government that we're really going to focus on, and that's the difference between a parliamentary system of government and a presidential system of government. And they're not connected to one another. You can have a parliamentary unitary, you could actually have a parliamentary federal system to some extent. Okay, so there's two different things, and what I'd like you to do throughout this video is to stop it along the way and take notes. And whatever questions you might have, also write down some questions so that when we come to class next time, you can ask those questions. Okay, so the first part, we'll talk about the unitary versus federal system of government, and I'll just get that over with in terms of a review primarily. Okay, so remember the unitary system of government is the definition. It's a system of government or governance in which political power is concentrated in a central national government. In other words, the government themselves, the central national government, holds most of the power. We have some modern examples. The United Kingdom is an example. China is an example. Iran is actually an example. Okay, so just because it's a unitary system does not tell you if it's a parliamentary or a presidential system, and I want to make that clear. Okay, so unitary system of government, power centered at the national government level. A federal system is a system of governance in which political authority is shared between the national government and the subunits. And of course, we've just talked about the Constitution for the United States as an example, perfect example, of a power sharing relationship between the national government and the subunits. Modern examples: United States, Russia, Mexico, Nigeria, to name a few. Okay? Cool. Now, I showed you this slide before, a spectrum of power distribution. Remember, this is something I made up, but just a way of showing you or representing to you how power might be distributed both in a numeric way and also in a graphical way. So what I said to you is, remember that imagine that there's only 100 units of power that any country governing body could ever have, right? In a unitary system of government, since the concentration of power is at the middle, let's just say that 90 units of power is at the national level and 10 is at the state level, right? So in this hypothetical situation where you divide power up into many units, 90 would be at the national level, 10 would be at the state level. So essentially, the national government has all power at the center, and the state would have very little. The United Kingdom is a good example of this. There actually is like a mayor of London that is a new creation by the British government, but the mayor of governor doesn't have any ability to extract taxes from people. So any programs that the mayor wants to do, he has to go or she has to go to the parliament and say, hey, the national government, and say, hey, could I have some money to fund this program? So really, even though these governments exist in reality, they really exist and they're functioning governments, they must ask the national power for money in most cases, and therefore who has the power? Of course, the national government has the power. Okay. A confederal system is pretty much the opposite of a unitary system. It's what the Articles of Confederation set up. And in my ridiculous notion of power, units of power, this would be an example. Would be like 10 of the 100 are held at the national level, and 90 units of power would be held at the state level. So you'd have a situation where the national government has very little real power to govern, whereas the subunits, or in the case of the United States, the states would have most of the power to govern. And this was the case under the Articles of Confederation. That's why it was called the Articles of Confederation. So what the Constitution created was a new system, really, borrowed from the ancients, but a new system for modern times where there was a power-sharing relationship between the national government and the subunits. In this case, 50 points, let's say, of power, units of power would be the national government, and 50 units would be at the state level. It's not really true because the federal government in the United States has actually like superiority over the state governments. But in terms of actually like jurisdiction on people's lives, it's pretty close to maybe 50-50 in what the states have power over certain things that the states have power, specific power the states have, and specific powers that the national government has. Okay, so there's just a numeric way of showing you the difference between a unitary, confederal, and federal system. And I showed this slide to you as well. If you were to make this a graph, right, what you would see is that the national power, this is a unitary system of government, And the national government has 90% of the power, whereas the state governments, represented by the blue here, or the subunits, would only have 10% of the power. If you were then to flip that to a confederal distribution of power, a confederal system, of course, is the opposite, where states, or the subunits, would have 90% of the power, right? And the national government would only have 10, as was the case with the Articles of Confederation. A graphical display of a federal system or federal distribution of power would be such that it's a 50-50 relationship, where the states over here, represented by the blue, have 50 units of power, and over here the yellow has, the national government has 50 units of power. Okay, so I put that out there just as a reminder, as a review, and also just because I think it's very interesting the way in which the different systems of government distribute power. Okay, so that's it for unitary and federal systems of power. That's how the government is structured to govern, by distributing governance or governing power. Okay, so that's what unitary and federal systems is talking about. Now I'm going to talk about parliamentary systems and presidential systems. Okay, parliamentary system, of course, is a system based on a parliament, and a presidential system is going to be based on the election of a president that's separate from the parliament. And let me just put this out there right away. The parliament has a prime minister. The head of a parliament is a prime minister. The prime minister's, he or she is the prime, in other words, like a number one, the most powerful minister of parliament. Whereas the president is not part of the legislative body, or not part of parliament, rather, is created as a separate unit. Okay, so parliamentary versus presidential systems of power, that'll make more sense in a second. Okay, so what's a parliamentary system? Definition. A parliamentary system, and I remind you to stop and take these notes down, is a system of governance in which the head of the government, the executive, is chosen by the legislature. So who's, in this case, it would be something like a prime minister. So in England right now, David Cameron is the prime minister. He is the chief executive of, of Great Britain. He's the guy who's in charge, right? He's the prime minister. But he's also part of Parliament. He's also part of the legislative branch. In fact, he can't be, or nobody can be, a prime minister of England without being also a member of the legislative branch, the Parliament. Because otherwise you can't be prime minister, because prime implies minister, which implies you have a seat in the legislature. Okay. So the characteristics of a parliamentary system then would be that there's a fusion of power, and this is a new term for you, but there's a fusion of powers. What are the powers? There's a fusion of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. This is the way that the United Kingdom is set up now. It's the way it was set up in 1776 when John and Ben and George and Thomas got all upset and declared independence. So this is the model, actually, that the Constitution is breaking away from. Okay? So there's a fusion of powers. You'll see what I mean by that. Just write that down and feel cool with it. Another characteristic of a parliamentary system is that the executive is born of the legislature. In other words, the executive branch is populated by members of the legislative branch. The only way to get into the executive branch is to first be elected to the legislative branch, and then the legislative branch would select you as its prime minister of the legislative branch. And if you're the prime minister, then you become the executive branch of England. Okay, so this idea of giving birth is kind of silly, but it's also quite helpful in terms of thinking about how a parliamentary system is structured. And I'm going to get into some graphics in a second, and you're going to be able to see it. So there's this notion of parliamentary sovereignty. That's a really key term you need to know. When there is a parliament, like in England, it's believed that the parliament is sovereign, which means it has the power to do what it wants. In other words, the parliament, in this case, generally speaking, it's the legislative branch, first and foremost, has the ability to control the executive branch and the judicial branch, and we'll see how in a second. Another characteristic of a parliamentary system is that the parliament can do what's called a vote of confidence to remove the prime minister. The prime minister, as I have mentioned, is a member of the legislative branch, and he is put, or she is put, into power by the parliament. or by the legislative branch. Therefore, all that has to happen in order for the Prime Minister to lose his or her position and for there to be new elections is for the Parliament to vote that they don't have confidence, or rather, that they want to remove this person as Prime Minister. Okay? Pretty simple to actually do. It's fairly rare, but it's simple in terms of the ability for the legislative branch to remove the person who's in charge of the executive branch, which is the Prime Minister. Because of this, there's also something called there's high party discipline, and because the way that Parliament is set up, if you have 50% majority of the seats in the House, in the case of the British system in the House of Commons, then you have the majority, and there's a lot behind this, but I want you to just realize that when a system is set up that way, if you are a member of the party and you're a young member of the party, there is a great incentive for you simply to follow suit with what the older members of the party tell you to do. And so a parliamentary system, maybe we can talk about this more in class, promotes high party discipline, which means that if you are part of a particular party, in the case of the UK, the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party, then, and even if you disagree with what the party wants to do, you still have the discipline to vote along with the party regardless of your personal views. One other characteristic that's really important about the parliamentary system is there's no direct election of the executive branch, right? Because the executive is born in the legislature. And of course, the best example, there's many examples of the parliamentary system. Israel has one. The United Kingdom, of course, is the one we've been using in class. So what's a presidential system? Well, a presidential system is an electoral system in which the chief executive, which is called the president, the presidential system, is elected in a national ballot, a national vote, and is independent of the legislative branch. Whoa, that is brand new and different. The president is independent of the legislative branch. In fact, if you want to be president of the United States, you may not be a member of the legislative branch. And the best example, the two most recent examples, I don't know if they're best, but the most recent is Barack Obama, the current president of the United States, of course, and Joe Biden, who is the current vice president of the United States. Both of those guys were senators. They were sitting in the legislative branch. They ran for president and vice president, and as soon as they won, they had to resign their seats, give up their seats in the legislative branch. And but in their cases, both of them were senators. So it's completely different. The president is not born of the legislative branch. In fact, the president's not allowed to be a part of the legislative branch, and there's a direct election by the people of the president, which does not happen in a parliamentary system. Characteristics, separation of powers. We talked about this in class, but there's a separation of the judicial, executive, and legislative branches. I'm going to show you a diagram, a graphic in a second that will bring that to light. There's a system of checks and balances, a system where each of those powers, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, have a way of checking. To check means to hold back or to stop the power of something else. And as a result of that, it sort of balances out, and none of the three branches of government can acquire too much power because the other two branches of government have the ability to rein it in. And the ridiculous example we used in class about the horse is really applicable. Each one of the branches of government can rein in, has two reins in its hand to pull back the power or to check the power of the other branches of government, which makes it balanced. Okay. Of course, there's the direct election of the president. Because there is, this gets fairly intricate as well, but there's very low party discipline in presidential systems, or lower presidential systems, because the executive branch and the legislative branch is not part of one entity. So it's not as costly to vote against your party. And a lot of times in the United States, you'll have Democrats and Republicans voting against what the rest of their party is doing. Because of that, really, there's a pretty inefficient policy process, because all of these checks and balances have to be taken into consideration. And gridlock, or in other words, the inability to move legislation through the legislation is more likely, either through the House of Representatives, the Senate, and then also has to go to the president. And if he vetoes it or she vetoes it in the future, it comes back to the Senate, and it just takes longer. Gridlock just means it gets locked up. Examples of this: United States, Mexico, Chile. Okay. So relationship with the legislature in both systems. This is kind of interesting. Even though they're very different, there are some things that are similar. The executive is the head of government. In the case of the presidential system, it's the president. In the case of the parliamentary system, it's the prime minister. In both cases, the legislature actually can remove the executive branch or the president. A vote of confidence in the parliamentary system, or as we talked about in class, the ability to impeach the executive or remove the executive, the president, from power. The Congress or the legislative branch in the presidential system has that power. The executive can introduce legislation. In both cases, the prime minister can say, hey, we want to make a bill about such and such. And in the case of the presidential system, the president can introduce legislation to the legislative branch. In both systems, the role of the legislature is to enact legislation, so therefore the executive needs the legislative branch in order to pass bills. It's kind of obvious, but it's kind of nice to see there. The executive branch needs the legislative branch because it can't actually make laws in either case. The executive branch in both cases influences the legislative agenda by drafting bills. Okay, so there is some overlap in the way in which they work because, as you're going to see, the presidential system was born of the parliamentary system. In other words, the parliamentary system was first, and the presidential system was a reaction to it, and therefore there's going to be some crossover. If you had a nice Venn diagram of all of this, it would be really chaotic, but in the middle, the overlapping would be these things that both systems do have. Okay, so let's get into some graphics. How would this look? Okay, well, a parliamentary system, what I want you to think about is Parliament is all-powerful. And I know that Parliament is, when you talk about the Parliament, you're talking about the House of Lords and the House of Commons. But just for a second, if you could just think about Parliament being a word, which it's used this way in England actually, to mean just the government itself. Okay, what you would see is that Parliament, and this is a nice analogy, Parliament is the mother. Parliament is the mother that gives birth, quite literally, to the other branches of government. In other words, without the Parliament, there would not be any other branches of government. What are those? Of course, they're the legislative branch, they're the executive branch, and they're the judicial branch. Now, the legislative branch is the branch of the British government that actually gets elected directly from the people, okay, which is why they talk about it being in Parliament. But because this is the only election that takes place, remember, Parliament actually decides who it's going to be its prime minister. So Parliament has the ability, or legislative branch has the ability to create the executive branch, which they do. And by the way, everybody who's in the prime minister's cabinet, his secretaries, they're also members of the legislative branch. So you have to you have to be in this branch in order to get in that branch. Likewise, in England, the judicial branch it's called now like the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom or something like that, but that's brand new, like in the last 5 or 6 years. It's really something called the Law Lords, and the Law Lords are people who sit in the legislative branch in the House of Lords, and are the ones who interpret laws to make sure that they're in line with English tradition and its constitution. Okay, so therefore there's this notion of parliamentary sovereignty where Parliament can do anything it wants. Okay, and of course the executive branch is headed up by the Prime Minister, who is also a member of the legislative branch. The judicial branch is made up of the Law Lords, and the Law Lords are also part of the legislative branch. So in reality, all of these people who populate this branch have seats in the legislative branch, and all the people that populate the judicial branch have seats in the legislative branch as well. All right, so this is a parliamentary system. Right now, when the United States was created, remember, they were British. And when you're British, you probably start off with a model that's British, and that's what they did. And they started off with this model, which was the Parliament, but they feared it, right? Because Parliament had all this power. Of course, the king is the head of state, and the king oversees the Parliament, and it's all just one big conglomerate of control. So In the presidential system, there are structures put in place that, well, part of the parliamentary system is destroyed and separated, and the power is shared more evenly. So the way this would look is, first of all, get rid of the prime minister, get rid of the law lords, get rid of this notion that parliament is mother, get rid of parliamentary sovereignty. Okay, but the structure of the government itself changes in that this notion of parliament disappears, and then what's left are three separate branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Aha. And now, because they are no longer connected, if you want to get into the executive branch, you can't be part of the legislative branch. And if you want to be a Supreme Court judge in the United States, you can't be a member of the legislative branch. And they are three separate entities. Okay, so the power of the parliament was separated out. This is why it's separated. Why was it? What was it separated from? The old parliamentary system, into three branches of government. Beautiful. But what was set up? Well, here are the reins and the system of checks and balances the executive branch has. The executive branch has the power in some capacities, and we won't get into the details because they're different for every country, to rein in the power of the legislative branch. And they have another rein here on the control and the power of the judicial branch. Likewise, the legislative branch has the ability to pull back and rein in the power of the executive branch, as it does have the power to rein in the power of the judicial branch. And just to make things fair, of course, the judicial branch has the ability to override or control the power of the legislative branch, and they also have the power to control and override the power of the executive branch. And what you end up here is with a system of checks and balances that's really quite slick. If any of these three branches of government try to acquire power, more power than what the Constitution gives them, they have two other entities pulling them back. If the President of the United States tries to get super powerful and tries to, I don't know, become a king, which was the fear of them back in the constitutional times, the system of government has it. The legislative branch can pull it back, and so can the judicial branch. Okay, so it's a pretty intricately woven system of government that has ensured over time, it's pretty incredible, that at least in the United States, that no branch of government acquired too much power, and therefore, the will of the people is followed, or, at least the best that it can. Power has been distributed into three even branches. Okay. So in the United States, of course, the legislative branch is called Congress, the executive branch is called the President, and the judicial branch in the United States is called the Supreme Court. And there's a lot to Congress. Of course, there's the House of Representatives and the Senate. The President has his cabinet. He has all of the agencies within the government. Embassies being one of them. If one of your parents work for the embassy, of course, they work for ultimately the President of the United States, or any president or prime minister for that matter, the executive branch of whatever country you come from. And then in the United States, the Supreme Court is the supreme judicial branch. Okay. So the Supreme Court is the highest portion of the judicial branch. That's what I meant. So I hope this helps you understand the three systems, the systems of government, and how they're different. The presidential system and a parliamentary system they're very, very different from one another. But at the same time, there's a logic to it here. The Parliament was first, and then there was independence movement, and the United States gets independence, and of course they want to set up a government that doesn't allow the consolidation of power. But how are you going to do that? And of course they had the Articles of Confederation. It didn't work out so well, so they created the Constitution, and the Constitution is the document that created this presidential system. All right. I hope that helps you. System of governments, unitary, confederal, and federal systems, and the parliamentary system of government versus the presidential system of government. Thanks a lot. If you have any questions, again, write them down. We'll talk about them next time.